Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And in the past few episodes of the podcast, we have been really looking in to the period around Vietnam, to that sort of political period. We looked at Truman and the Truman Doctrine. We've looked at the Saturday Night Massacre. We looked at that. And today, we're sort of on the other side of it, and that is Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon. And Chris, this is probably I don't think it was deliberately scheduled to be this way, but this is probably one of the most timely episodes we've recorded on a historical event.
Yeah, absolutely, because usually what happens is when one president is out the door, one of the things that they do towards the end of their presidency is they go and look back at maybe people that they feel have been wronged, or they might be calling in, favors, or, whatever it might be. But the president has the right to grant pardons to anyone concerning any crime. And we've just recently seen that the current president, Joe Biden, in one day gave over 1,000 pardons in one day for a variety of different reasons. But also we know that President Biden has received scrutiny on both sides of the political realm for the pardoning of his own son. And what I find to be interesting is that when Biden talks about pardoning his son, you have President Ford, who kind of, or President Biden uses kind of the same terminology and the same words for what he is about to do with Nixon, and basically, saying that, hey, this is my personal responsibility, or my personal beliefs, but it's also my presidential responsibility. So both of these things kind of go together with Ford as well as Biden. So it is very, very timely.
Yeah, you were talking about how the president does have that power. It's found in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. The president shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States. And Chris, the only, I guess you could say, brackets put around that power is impeachment. That's it. Treason, everything else, as long as it's federal, they can't pardon a county, city, state crime, but everything else is on the table. So, presidents, like you said, when they walk out of office, they sort of, I always say they fling those pardons around like candy on Halloween.
And I think, there's two things to this. We go back and look at President Ford. He's coming off of a very, very difficult time, when something's going on. It requires a lot, that happens. And so, it's a pretty tough situation what he's about to experience.
Yeah, it is. And he's not really, when you think about it, Chris, Gerald Ford is not really, a president with what we could call a mandate. Gerald Ford is the only person to serve as president who was never elected to be vice president. He was never elected to be president. He became vice president upon the resignation. I believe it was Spiro Agnew, right? And then just a few months later, after Richard Nixon resigns on August 9, 1974, he becomes president. So he was never elected. So it's not like, okay, we got this guy coming into office with a mandate. He's never elected, and then he steps in, and one of the first things he does as president is to grant a pardon, which, as we're going to see, was not popular at all.
And I think it goes back to the aspect of, bowing down to this public pressure. And I think you see the public pressure on behalf of Nixon towards Ford, but, Ford towards Nixon, because, the whole way of Ford coming into the presidency has some historians saying that it was kind of on the, I lose the terminology, but a political give back,
Right.
I scratch
Like
your back.
like a corrupt bargain type thing.
Yes, a kickback. That's where we go. Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And, because the reality is that everybody under the moon understood that President Nixon had engaged in illegal activities. There was, I mean, you can try to cover it up, but as we mentioned in our last episode about the tapes, I mean, he had pretty much incriminated himself.
Yeah.
And so he's the first American president to resign. And so as he's got that getting in the helicopter with I am not a crook, you have to ask yourself, well, I mean, he knew he was guilty. Everybody else knew he was
Mhm.
guilty. Is he doing this because he wants to try to save face as much as he can? Or is there a hidden agenda as he's getting on that helicopter, knowing I'm bowing out, but I also know that the guy that's over there in the Oval Office now, he's got my back. He's going to take care of me.
And of course, that was certainly the accusation when Ford came out with this pardon on September 8, 1974. And actually, there were people in Ford's own administration who were like, "No, this is not a good idea." The White House press secretary for Ford actually resigned over this, believing that this was just not a good thing, that Nixon had committed crimes, as you say, and needed to be held accountable for those crimes. But, Ford made some interesting arguments for doing this. He talked about the need for the country to move on from Watergate.
And the other thing is that he doesn't make this decision all by himself, but
Yeah.
that he's quietly making headway into an investigation. He's doing some research. He's got some people that are kind of helping to say, okay, do I have the legal precedent to even be able to issue a pardon for this? And people, the reporters, when he comes into his first news conference or his first press conference, well, everybody's asking
Mm-hmm.
him questions about Nixon. And so, as soon as he gets into the gate of being president of the United States, he's still having to deal with things of the past, and
Yeah.
it's not giving him the opportunity to focus on things in the present. He
So
can't move on. He's got to still deal with Nixon. Nixon's a ghost is still in the White House.
Nixon won't go away. So when he said, that we basically need to move on, it's almost like he said, "I need to move on."
And how do you move on? I mean,
Okay.
is it the simple way of just saying, I'm going to move on? You can just wash your hands of this and say, I'm just going to pardon you, because if you do not pardon, you're then going to be dealing with a trial. You're going to be dealing with depositions and subpoenas. And he's the vice president. And so
Yeah.
there's going to be the reality that he's going to be involved in having to answer questions and having to meet with lawyers. And, he's got skin in this also, because he was the
Yeah.
vice president during this time. So I think, one of his things is saying, gosh, if I just pardon this guy, I ain't got to deal with him anymore. I can just move right into the White House and do my thing and just be done with Richard Nixon. And I do believe that ultimately what he wanted especially was to just be done with Richard Nixon. And he thought that a simple pardon would do it. Now to do that pardon, he had to have a good reason to be able to do it, as you mentioned earlier, and that is where he comes about with his it is the presidential responsibility to,
Yeah.
quote, heal the nation, but also his personal beliefs. I'm going to insert my own thoughts. Hey, if you are willing to just pardon me for all my future issues, I can make you my vice president and you can be, president one day.
Are you asserting that Richard Nixon was crooked?
Uh, Absolutely.
Oh, I thought he said he was not a crook.
He said it, he was not a crook. But I go back to and I did not research this. This is off my head. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Spiro Agnew was his first vice
Yeah.
president, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the one that he chose, Spiro Agnew, had resigned just a little bit earlier because he, quote, was a crook.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so if you hang around crooks, you're probably going to be a crook.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You get in the car and the guy goes into the bank and he steals a bunch of money and then he gets back into the car with you and y'all go off. Well, yeah, he stole the money, but you the one that took him there and you the one that took him away from there. You're
Yep.
hanging around the crook. And so now you have Agnew who resigns. Nixon's president. He says, okay, I got to find. Well, he knew Ford wasn't a crook. Ford's this where he went, was it Notre Dame or Navy? He played football at one of
Yeah, he
these,
played football. I don't remember where.
and it might have been Michigan. But he was a big time football player, which some people will say also go back to Saturday Night Live skits. Chevy Chase
Chevy
does
Chase, yeah,
great impersonation of, of Gerald Ford, using a tree as a phone and tripping over desk and the dog
falling down the airplane
and
steps.
all
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
And its reality is many people have said that Gerald Ford would never have been president of the United States if it hadn't been for President Nixon. I'll add to that. Gerald Ford never would have been vice president of the United States
right.
unless Nixon knew that there was someone that he could use to get what he wanted, which ultimately would then give him the White House. I mean, right, I just have no other way to say it that I think that that's the way it happened
Yeah,
is that Nixon goes to Ford, you do this for me, I'll do that for you. My other vice president, well, he's gone now, so here you go. Now that's just my opinion. People over there, you might be big presidential Ford fans, and sorry, but I just think that
well, I think that's the accusation that has been leveled at Ford throughout the years. It was at the time, and I think it has been ever since. Is that going back to the Andrew Jackson 1824 thing of a corrupt bargain? That there was some sort of deal between unspoken deal, maybe, but a deal between Nixon and Ford that if Nixon left, Ford would take care of him.
and we have to the reaction of the public to this announcement is very similar to the public's reaction to the announcement by President Biden over the pardon of his son. Both of them said, I am going to give a pardon. And Nixon, or excuse me, Ford specifically said, I am going to grant a full, free, and absolute. That means
Mm-hmm.
it's absolute against anything that he has committed or may have
Yep.
committed. Well, President Biden does the same thing with
Yep.
his, and so the public is like, well, wait a second. This is carte blanche. This is just giving like whatever he's done, he just gets away from it. Well, what about the average citizen who maybe wasn't able to pay their taxes for 2 years because they've fallen on hard times, didn't have any money, and so that average citizen was thinking, listening to this, I thought we said that nobody's above the law. How does he get a pardon and I get punished for not paying my taxes?
Yeah, and one could argue that what Nixon did was much worse than someone not paying their taxes for 2 years. But you know what this led to? And I think there are two things this led to, and I'll let you comment on it. Number one, in October of 1974, Gerald Ford became the first president in American history to go before Congress to answer questions. So that's number one. Not a good image for President Ford. Number two, President Ford is going to lose in 1976 to Jimmy Carter. And I think his pardon of Nixon played a major role in that. Now, of course, one could look to he made a statement, and it was about foreign affairs and the debate that was inaccurate, and the moderator gave him opportunity to correct it, and he just dug his hole deeper. Um, again, look at how he became vice president, how he became president. Maybe he was destined to be a one-term president anyway, but I've got to think that the pardon. I'll get it out in a second. The pardon played a role in limiting him to only one term.
And I think that it does limit him to one term, but I also do think that by him being willing to go to Capitol Hill, he didn't have to. I mean, he didn't really have to. He could have sat there and found a way to get out of whatever, but he was willing to give sworn testimony in which he was transparent and he shared. Did he share all of it? Probably not. Did he share, look, this was the deal? But he was willing to answer questions, sworn. And I think that over time, people began to reconsider
Yeah.
President Ford's action, because we also have to understand Vietnam is still around during this particular time. There is a major war that is going on where people are tired of it, because this is a war that has impacted Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. It's now upon Ford. I mean, that's four presidents. The Civil War was one president. World War II, one president. World War One, basically one. I mean, this has now gone through four presidents, and the nation is like, wait a second, we got all these things going on. I gotta move on too, just like Ford was trying to do, because they begin to see, okay, here's a guy who is getting up there telling him why he's willing to talk about it, and why he's willing to say this is what's happening, because he wants the country to move on.
Yeah.
He needs the country to move on, and the country needs to move on. And so I think at that time they begin to say, yeah, we got a point there.
Yeah, and in 2001, he was awarded the Kennedy Foundation Profiles in Courage Award, which I think is part of what you're referencing there. And Senator Ted Kennedy, talked about how he had in 1974 spoke out against what did by pardoning Nixon, and then in 2001 said, "No, I think Nixon did the right thing." It's a
Well, yeah.
it's an example sometimes, Chris, of how everybody likes to judge the president sitting in office right now, but sometimes history gives you a slightly different perspective on that president and the actions that they took.
And if I'm not mistaken, what was the name of that award?
The John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award.
Yeah. So Profiles in Courage, which is a great book that John F. Kennedy actually has written, that details many people in American history who truly exhibited profiles in courage, and Andrew Johnson's one of those guys, and there's several other characters that come about. And it's a book that I've had my students read before in American history courses, because it details the tremendous stress that comes upon a person to act morally and with strong values as to doing the right thing. And, I do find it interesting that Ford was honored because, as you mentioned, I think he was willing to be a martyr just to help move the nation forward. How he got the position, that's always up for debate. But I do believe that President Ford was that president that simply said, "Guys, it's not about me. I I, I fell into this seat." And that's literally how it happened. He fell into that seat. But when he got there, he said, "Okay, now that I'm here, this is what I'm going to do."
Yeah, we're going to do what we got to do. And maybe he is a profile in courage if we think of it from that perspective, that he did, knowing whether Nixon and he had discussed it beforehand, which of course he denied, or whether there was some sort of unspoken agreement between the two men. He still, in pardoning Nixon, you know, hurt his presidency. And that's not something presidents like to do.
No, but I do believe that somewhere it's written down how
Yeah,
he got his job.
it may
And I
be.
don't know if it's locked down like who killed Kennedy, or if there's UFOs, or all of the things, the conspiracy theorists are just rooting on Donald Trump to just
Yeah.
open the vault and to let it all out. And
Who killed Kennedy? What happened to Elvis? We're going to
yeah,
cover it all.
and did OJ do it? Because I still need to know. I
Yeah.
mean, I need to know if OJ did it.
Personally,
And
I can't move on with my life till I find out.
right. And these are all old school reference,
Yeah.
or newer generations probably thinking, who are these? But I do think that somebody somewhere has the answer to that.
Yeah.
And I'm surprised. I really am surprised, because this isn't like a watershed moment in American history per se, as the Kennedy thing and as some other things. But I'm surprised that it hasn't received more attention.
Yeah.
And maybe it will now with what President Biden's done, because I don't know if I mean, there's been some crazy pardons. I remember Clinton did one.
Yeah.
You
Clinton
know,
pardoned his brother.
yes, Roger, right? That was Roger Clinton.
Yep.
Um, and there was another one, but I wonder maybe if with what Biden's done that maybe this gets more attention. But I will ask the question. I know time's probably running up, but I'll ask the question. Can you compare Biden and Ford? You know, is what Biden doing? Go back to what both of them said. That Ford was doing it for the best for the betterment of the country. You know, is that what Biden did?
Oof, that's a loaded question. I think my personal view would be they're not the same. I think Ford was looking at, okay, the country needs to move on, the presidency needs to move on. I think Biden's doing it because he's afraid that a Trump administration would go after his son even more. And look, that may be a legitimate fear on his part. And, maybe if we were in the same situation, we would do the same thing. But I think it is different.
It's different, but it's the same because both individuals, because Ford's pardoning of Nixon affected his legacy.
Yeah.
Biden's pardoning of his son affects his legacy.
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
last thing people will remember about Biden will not be the, one-term president now.
Mm-hmm.
One-term president. The thing that people will remember about Biden, honestly, is one debate with Trump,
Yeah.
the the getting knocked off a presidential nomination by your own people.
Mm-hmm.
Last thing, well, not gonna say last thing because we still got another month, but
Yeah.
the next thing will be the pardon.
Yeah.
But that's so his
I think you're right.
legacy is because he did what he thought, like Ford, personal beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
and to protect my family. Um,
I don't think it would have been as bad with Biden if he hadn't spent so long saying he wasn't going to do it. You know?
or or if he would have gone to some congressional committee and raised his right hand and given sworn testimony like Ford. Because
Yeah.
how Ford gets out of this, what changes with Ford is he was willing to go to Congress to the people who didn't like him,
Yeah.
and he answered the questions. And I
Yeah.
do think by being transparent, because that's what you were referring to,
Yeah.
swinging, depending on the day, and saying, I'll never do that. Well, I need to do that because my person didn't win.
Yep.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. So a lot of respect for Ford because the only things that people remember him by is the Ford Motor Company, and he has nothing to do with the Ford Motor Company except that he was in Michigan and Betty Ford. And we're heaven help us, we can't talk about Miss Betty because that would take a whole episode.
Well, yeah, you've got with Gerald Ford, and there are parallels with Gerald Ford and Joe Biden, both one-term presidents. They both fallen, um, made a controversial pardon. So there are some, Gerald Ford fell down the Air Force One steps, and I think he also fell up on one time. And Joe Biden, of course, fell off the bike, and I think he stumbled on the steps. Yes, he did. He stumbled on the steps going up into Air Force One, which I can't speak trash about Biden or Ford doing that because now I have fallen upstairs before myself. So,
And you only have one step leading to your house.
two. To
Two.
be fair, let's
Not,
be fair.
not the 50, I guess, that he's got.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I think this was a great episode. I hope our listeners enjoyed it. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like on Spotify, on YouTube. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. Find us on Facebook. Interact with us. We'd be glad to hear from you. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.